Okay, I'm calling to order the meeting, the Board of Directors meeting of August 16th. Need a roll call, please?
Director Gibson.
Here.
Director Kohler.
Here.
Vice President Schmidt.
Here.
Director Bragman.
Here.
And President Russell.
Here. Okay, I need a motion to adopt the agenda.
Move approval of the agenda.
Second.
Any public comment on the agenda?
There are none.
Okay, I need roll call, please.
Director Gibson.
Aye.
Director Kohler.
Aye.
Vice President Schmidt.
Aye.
Director Bragman.
Aye.
And President Russell.
Aye. Okay, now we're looking for public comment on any item not on the agenda.
Okay, we have one public comment, but I would like to let the public know before I call on any speaker to please pay attention to our timer. Once it will come up, it will change colors from a light color to a dark color, basically indicating that your time is gradually decreasing. At the 15-second mark, you will hear a slight sound. That means you have 15 seconds left of your comments. And then around the 1 second mark, you'll hear more of a ringing sound that says basically your time is up. So the first speaker we have is Mr. Clayton Smith. Go ahead, Mr. Smith.
Yeah, two things. The first is I really would like to have a sense of when the project on East Blythedale is anticipated to be completed. That would be helpful. I had difficulty getting a clear answer from the people in Mill Valley. The second thing on the desalination process, I know you don't have the cameras on now, but there's a San Francisco Baykeeper article that recently came out called Toxic Pollutants and Chemicals of Concern. I'm not sure if you're aware of it, but there are people now who are particularly concerned about the both the desalination of bay water and also reaching up into the water coming down from the Sacramento River out of the valley. What it says here is that currently only 91 contaminants are regulated by Safe Drinking Water, the Safe Drinking Water Act, while approximately 100,000 chemicals have been registered or approved for use in the United States over the last 30 years since that act was passed. And so I think it's an organization I'm going to try to find out. They're looking for volunteers right now, but it's an organization that's going to be looking at all of the plans, I think, for not only Marin Municipal Water District, but the other water districts that are beginning to face the issue that you're facing right now, which is the lack of rain. And my final thought, I think that the issue of cloud seeding, or what we could call geoengineering to fill the reservoirs, should not be discounted at this point. It's becoming clearer and clearer that this is an issue of major interest. Not only that, but I think the tell in this was the recent strange death of Anne Hedge, who was doing a movie exactly on this subject. And there's lots of controversies about that death and about the attempts to silence this information. So I think it's something that we all who are concerned with water and rainfall and everything need to start paying very particular attention to. Thank you.
Thank you.
And Paul, can we get that completion date that he's looking for?
I can give you that. It's
hi, Crystal.
Yeah, hi, Crystal Yesman, Director of Engineering. Yeah, we just have a few tie-ins left, and we'll be done on August 30th in just a couple of weeks. But the project itself, the rest of the project is the city-run repaving project, which you'd have to go to the city's website to get that update, but I think they still have, you know, I don't know how much longer they're going to be working, but we'll be out of there in a couple of weeks. We're 95% complete.
Thank you.
Next speaker is Melvin Wright. Go ahead, Mr. Wright.
Yes, I'm Mel Wright of Woodacre. I'm thankful for this opportunity to speak. Among the ideas that surface in this discussion about water shortage is desalination. I'm opposed to that. The concentrated chemical discharges to the marine environment, the emissions of air pollutants, and the high energy demand of the process. Raising dams. I'm not sure of negative impacts of raising dams, but I believe it's worth considering, as it would give us more control of heavy rains when they come and maintaining an adequate life-supporting flow into the Lagunitas Creek watershed. Another possibility is importing more water from other districts. And I know we do that now, but how dependable will that be in the future? Climate change is upon us now, and we are going to experience extremes in weather events well beyond the foreseeable future. We could minimize some of the effects by practicing greater water conservation and recycling. Water saved is future supply. We could encourage native landscaping that's adapted to long dry periods. We could curtail some waste by not hosing driveways and sidewalks, and we could discourage power washing of buildings and decks and cease midday overhead watering of municipal commercial landscaping and discouraging the planning and maintenance of lawns. There are many ways that we can use less. Anyway, to sum up, I prefer we increase our water supply by the conscientious use of what we have, by conservation and recycling overlooking elsewhere for sources. We can begin to do this now without resorting to large scale, expensive projects that come at a significant cost to our environment and our pocketbooks. Thank you.
Thank you. And the next speaker we have is Mr. James Krajewski. Go ahead, Mr. Krajewski.
Hi, thank you. Once again, I'm commenting on the same subject. Namely, back in April, Director Kohler proclaimed that the water district has never rationed water since she's been on the board, which is since 2005, I think. She can correct that if that's not correct. As board members have heard on multiple occasions, I've requested a definition of rationing that Director Kohler was using and a source for that definition. I've never received any response to my emails or to my comments at the board meetings. That is zero. I don't know what purpose that serves the board. It certainly doesn't serve any purpose for me. If she doesn't want to answer and doesn't want to respond, then why not just say so? Kind response would be, I'm not going to respond. Instead, she sits silently. I say the same thing at every meeting. The board hears the same thing at every meeting. And this is the legacy that goes on and on and on. I don't know what the purpose of it is. I would love to know that. I may ask another question of what is the purpose of this? And then finally, I would say that I would ask all the directors that I hope that you will respond in a way to questions that come in from customers that is appropriate and responsive. Thank you.
Thank you. There are no further comments.
Okay, thank you. It's time for general manager and director's announcements. Are you going to give anything for Ben, Crystal?
No, we have no general manager announcements tonight.
Okay. Jack?
No, I have no announcements.
Okay. Larry?
Nothing tonight, thank you.
Thank you. Monty?
Nope, nothing tonight.
Cynthia?
Nothing from me.
Okay, nothing from me. With that, I need a motion to approve the consent calendar.
Move.
So before we do that, I'd actually like to take the general manager's report off of the consent calendar, if that's okay. Larry Bragman and I were not at the last meeting, and there's some items in there that I think merit further conversation, specifically around demand management. So if we could either do that, you know, at the Conservation Committee tomorrow, that might be a good place. I don't want to belabor things tonight, but since it's an approval item, I'm just a little concerned about going forward with some of that without further board conversation, especially since I've heard from several constituents who were somewhat alarmed by the last meeting and the impression that they had that the board had made a decision not to include demand management as a water supply alternative in the water supply assessment. So I just want to make sure that we have an opportunity for the full board to have that conversation at some point.
We can remove it from the consent calendar for approval tonight if that's the interest of the board. We don't have it agendized for tomorrow's meeting, so I'm afraid we wouldn't have the opportunity to discuss it, but we can move it to a future meeting if there's an interest.
Great. That's perfect. Let's do that. Thanks, Molly.
Okay, with that, I'll move approval of the consent calendar, the modified consent calendar.
Second.
Director Bragman, are you going to abstain from the minutes since you weren't here on August 2nd?
Oh.
Yes, yeah, that's fine. Yeah.
Okay.
And
I just wanted to double check. Okay.
Right, right. And yeah, and I wasn't able to be here either, so thanks.
Right. Perfect. Thank you. So Director Gibson.
Okay, I'll make a motion to approve the consent calendar as amended again.
And it does look
She's
like
asking for your vote, Jack.
Say what?
might,
Oh, I'm looking for a vote. All right. Aye.
it does look like we have a public comment, Terry. I wasn't sure if you saw that hand.
Oh, yes, we do. Thank you. Before we do the vote, let's have one more comment. Okay. Thank you. Go ahead, Mr. Phil Sauter.
Thank you. Just a point of clarification. When we say approve the consent calendar, I wanted to comment on one of the items in the general manager's report. Should I have done that in items not on the agenda, or will there be a chance to comment on the general manager's report in item number 2?
That's a tricky question, Phil.
We've actually removed that from the agenda, am I right?
We have removed it.
I think in all fairness, since Phil didn't know we were going to do that, I would like to let him make his comment now, since it would otherwise have come under items not agendized with the board's permission.
It's okay with me. I don't know. What about it, Molly?
I think it's fine if he wants to make a public comment on that item. He can
have at it, Phil.
Thank you very much, and I'll limit it to 2 minutes. I'd like to comment on item number 7 in the general manager's report having to do with demand management, which I think is a great way to describe conservation. It helps elevate our discussion of conservation to include setting priorities and objectives, and to identify management programs that are both significant and reliable. By significant, I mean programs that have the opportunity to reduce demand in the thousands of acre-feet annually. Programs that include goals, performance measurements, adequate budgets, and diagnostics that allow us to modify our efforts as we learn from experience. For example, I believe I heard a few years ago that leaks represent 10% of our annual usage, or about 2,000 acre-feet annually, but we don't seem to have enough information to track down and fix these leaks reliably. I also believe we concluded that outdoor water use by residential customers accounts for about 5,000 acre-feet annually. And we know that turf replacement programs are reliable. These are just 2 examples that could improve water supply in the thousands of acre-feet annually. And that's in line with other water supply options we're considering. I've also been made aware of water conservation consultants who have expertise in tracking down system losses. I hope as the months go by that the board and the public will start seeing a handful of demand management programs populated by actual numbers for potential results and delivered results, and the budgets necessary to make these programs effective. Thank you.
Thank you. There are no further comments.
Roll call.
Director Gibson.
Aye.
Director Kohler.
Aye.
Vice President Schmidt.
Aye.
Director Bragman.
Aye.
And President Russell.
Aye. Okay, Thanks, everyone. Item 6. Item 6. It's a contract.
Crystal, I think that's.
Yeah, sorry about that. Yeah, so tonight we have Steve Messick here. He's our IT manager, and he's going to present this item. Steve?
You're on mute, Steve.
Thank you. Sorry about that. So this item is our Esri GIS licenses. We've been on an older license or older contract with Esri for many years, and they're changing their licenses to what's called an enterprise license, which essentially is a bulk license. The agreement we're looking at is basically up to 100 users for a fixed price every year of $55,000. That's for a 3-year contract. So that's basically, we're on a current named users, which is a limit, it's individual user licenses. We currently have 58 licenses, and we're at the top of that limit. So with the enterprise license, we can go up to 100 users, and it's just a little bit more cost per year, and that's a 3-year agreement. So I'd like to get that approved.
Yeah, I also add that it locks in the rate for 3 years. The individual licenses increase every year, so it's definitely a benefit to the district.
How much are we spending on the individual licenses?
Well, we're expecting. Go ahead, Steve. Go ahead. Sorry.
We currently spend $38,000 a year on, that's for the 58 licenses. We don't know the increase for this year. We estimate it's going to be between 12 and 17,000 increase. So I took the
about the same.
Yeah, I took the conservative $12,000 number, which would mean we're paying a little bit more this year, 4,000 more for the enterprise. But we're that then we can use up to 100, have up to 100 users versus the 58.
Larry?
I mean, if the demand is there, we should do it. So, Crystal, can we expand the use? Or Steve?
Oh yes, certainly. We always have. We're always right up to our limit. When we have interns come in and we want to get them on the computer, we only have 2 intern licenses beyond our individual licenses. So, that are already fully utilized. So it'd be nice to have that a little bit of that extra flexibility to add users when needed.
Yeah, certainly. And it's 4,000. It gets you another 40 licenses or 40 users. Right. So yeah, sounds like a good deal. So,
sure.
Yeah. So I would move approval.
Second.
Any public comment? I don't know.
Terry, any public comment?
There are none.
Okay, roll call.
Director Gibson.
Aye.
Director Kohler.
Aye.
Vice President Schmidt.
Aye.
Director Bregman.
Aye.
And President Russell.
Aye. Okay, item 7.
Good evening, directors and members of the public. Paul Sellier, Water Resources Director. We have a short presentation tonight on our water supply update. Tonight we'll take a look at our current water supply and look at our our normal projections, but then we're also going to peek at NOAA and some weather blog information and see if we can gain any insights into what's coming next year. So cue the scary music. And we'll wrap up with a summary, but let's go quickly through this because this hasn't changed much. Obviously, we're in the dry period, so no rain. Our rain for the year is this blue line here with our average. So we're just a couple inches below the water year average. And that water year runs from October 1st through the end of September each year. So we're currently in water year 2022, which is going to wrap up at the end of September. Looking at our reservoir storage, the sort of bright navy blue line here, and the black line just below it is our average. So that this blue line is our actual reservoir storage. So we're doing great. We're above average. We'd love to be spilling, but that's pretty rare this time of year. So we're doing well. And one thing to note on this chart is just the slight difference in slope of this blue line compared to the average.
Mhm.
And that really reflects, you know, some of the water we were able to bring in from Sonoma. If you remember, this was a record year for us, I think 8902 acre feet. And then of course, no small part played by conservation, which we'll take a look at a little bit later, changes the slope of this chart here. And so conservation, if we look on a monthly savings basis between 2020, July of 2020 and July of this year, we're actually 27% down, which is great. On an annual basis, year to year, July through July, from 2020, this is 25% down from 2020 year on year. So we're doing much better than the state savings targets. And our customers are doing a great job. And I too was on a walk yesterday and noticed some very large properties with large brown lawns. So I think folks are helping out. As we take a peek forward then into what our water storage in the reservoir system is going to look like, this red dot here is the end of the water year. So we'll be finishing the water year at about 60,000 acre feet, which is, I think our average at the end of September is normally around 58. So right around average, just a hair above. So again, we're doing well. And if we take a look out into 2023, the orange dashed line represents just 25% of rainfall and runoff. The blue line being 50% of rainfall and runoff. And the green dashed line would be if we hit our average runoffs and rainfalls. So that's our projections. As we turn then to look and see if NOAA can give us any insight further out, this is, you know, starting with their sort of quarterly forecast. I don't think they went terribly far out on the limb here to suggest that the drought was going to continue in the West. But as we move sort of a little bit further out, it's kind of interesting in terms of what it means for us in this 3-month forecast. Precipitation wise, really, they're just saying it's going to be normal. This sort of equal chances reflects it's just going to be normal rainfall for us across the summer. And really that's almost zero for us. But what is interesting is, you know, they're predicting, and today was no exception, above average temperatures for us. So we're sort of in the higher level of leaning above, as their helpful legend calls it. So we're definitely warmer as we move forward. So we start looking out a little further. This is where folks turn to looking at whether it's a El Nino year or a La Nina year. And the forecast does look like La Nina is going to continue at least through December. And so this forecast is just a probability of occurrence. And so, yeah, for the moment, La Nina appears to be what's forecast. So what then does that actually mean for us? So as we turn to look at what La Nina means sort of in a bigger picture, I think it's pretty well understood. You see this jet stream get pushed up to the north, and it tends to be wetter in the north. But when you start looking in our area in California, it says we're about 102% of average rainfall, but really it's not a strong indicator any way you look at it. So there doesn't appear to be a strong correlation. So as we drill down a little bit further and look at the Bay Area, so this is for San Francisco, the Golden Gate weather blog has looked at La Nina years and El Nino years since 1950 to try to understand if there was some correlation with rainfall patterns in the Bay Area. And they really, you know, short of a you know, really strong El Nino for the sort of southern area of the state, there doesn't really seem to be a significant wetter, dry year pattern that they can sort of tie to La Nina or El Nino. When we look at our rainfall locally, it does show us tend towards a little bit drier locally. So when we when they're talking about La Nina, and this now is some information from the Weather West blog to give us a little bit more insight maybe into what's going to happen next year, or in the next rainy season, I should say. So this blue area across the middle of this chart indicates the cool surface ocean temperatures around the equator throughout the Pacific. And then you'll notice up here in the right-hand corner, this is the coast of California, and you see the red and sort of yellow area there indicating warm waters off the coast of California. And this is from Daniel Swain, who writes this blog, and he's a Stanford PhD who is pretty well followed in the sort of climate prediction world. He's explaining that this warm water is what's causing our coastal areas to feel kind of muggy and humid. I don't know if you've noticed that, but I certainly have around here. It's been far more humid than we've ever had before. But these are, according to Daniel Swain, these are very unusual pattern that we're seeing with this strong La Nina surface temperatures here in this narrow band around the equator, but very, very warm waters in the Northern Pacific. You don't normally see this sort of big difference like that. The last time we saw this was maybe 2014, and it wasn't quite as strong as this. And so I looked and tried to understand what did sort of that winter of 2014, 2015 mean for us. That year, we were below normal. We got about 40 inches of rain that year. But half of that rain, more than half of that rain came in December of 2014, 23 inches in 1 month. That one storm brought us 47,000 acre feet of runoff. So really, just does show how really important those Pineapple Express, if you want to call them that, or atmospheric rivers, as they're calling them today, are to our water supply locally. But it's tough to really say, is it going to be another year where you get 40 inches with half of it coming in December, or are we going to get, just kind of a steady few inches every month? So we won't know, but all indications do seem to be that it's going to be a below normal winter at this point. And I guess I would finish up my sort of magic 8-ball forecasting by just saying that, forecasts like this are almost guaranteed to be wrong. But it does seem like there's some strong indications that we'll have a drier than normal winter, but how much drier is tough to say. So drought conditions persisting across the West. La Nina is predicted to continue through December, and then it's sort of a more neutral forecast at that point. And we're going to continue to just watch those anomalous temperatures in the Pacific. It could be a representation of that resilient ridge that comes in and starts blocking storms for California that we've seen in past years, but we don't know yet. Our reservoir storage, though, thankfully, we're in good shape, and we're going to finish the water year in good shape, and conservation is going strong, so we're thankful for that. And that concludes the presentation for this evening. If there's any questions, I'd be happy to answer them.
I have a question.
Thank you, Paul.
I have a question. On the water we're taking from the Russian River, has the amount we take month to month been pretty consistent since the Costanza improvement early in the year, or are you getting any variations in month to month?
So as of July 1st this year, we've been curtailed to about 3.8 million gallons per day. And that curtailment is going to continue through October unless we get some rain. If we get rains and then the flow, those winter flows in the Russian pick up, that's when we'll be able to take advantage of our system resources like Castania.
Okay, and why do we have the curtailment? Just for an explanation.
Yeah. So the Sonoma County Water Agency filed a temporary urgency change petition to reduce the releases of water from Lake Sonoma. Mm-hmm. And in order to do that and support that petition, right, all of the contractors were asked to reduce their usage.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
That's maybe a little generous there, Paul.
It's the English in me.
Larry?
Yeah, I saw New York Times, LA Times, Chronicle, even the IJ had an article from sourced quoting, liberally from Swain, warning us about a deluge that we're facing.
1 in 50 chance, though.
Yeah, but
yeah,
I mean, it certainly raised the probability, that we could be getting socked with some, major storms. And I'm just wondering, where's that fit in with our planning, or does it just completely disrupt the planning and
you mean in terms of the assessment process that we're undertaking, the strategic?
Yeah, I mean, and just how do we factor that into our planning?
Well, we look over our history and we see that there's been a number of years where we have been sort of experienced these savior storms, and what we want to do is try to understand if that is, be prepared to take advantage of those, which is the sort of local storage options that we're looking at. And so that kind of analysis would factor in there. But again, are savior storms the only thing we want to be doing, or would we be looking at the portfolio approach where we're wrapping in conservation? We're talking about some of these other potential supplies that we could, that maybe we'll be looking at in the future. So
we might want to dump that term savior. It sounds like pray for rain.
Yeah. Well, yeah.
Yeah.
Just as a comment. I mean, I understand it, but it may not be the best term.
Yeah.
Yeah, we kind of have to play both ends against the middle, it seems to me. We have to be ready on both ends of the spectrum.
Right.
That's exactly right.
Yeah. Yeah. Kind of an unfair question, but I just wanted to put that out there because that is the media coverage of the week as far as precipitation goes. Major.
Did you see that op-ed in the New York Times this Sunday from the Nevada, Reno-based reporter? It was a fantastic article about the problems in the Colorado River Basin with respect to rainfall and demand. Mm-hmm. And it is, you could take the same article and write it about California without hardly changing anything. But if you haven't seen it, you should read it, because the young man who wrote it did a masterful job of characterizing the Colorado River situation with the 22-year drought and the once in 1,200 years and all that kind of stuff. And today, you're probably aware that they were unable to come to an agreement. The 7 states that share the river couldn't come to an agreement. So that throws them up into a tizzy right now of what to do about the lowered availability of water.
Yeah, I've heard LA is looking at some pretty big cutbacks.
Yeah, and unfortunately, what the young man concluded exactly on is that even under the situation they're in right now, 70 to 80% of the water goes to agriculture. And that was the analogy I saw to California, that he was actually proposing sort of a water czar or a water bank to straighten it out, to put the water where it belongs and curtail agriculture, basically, which of course has a double-edged sword.
Yeah. Well, another approach is the state needs to start buying up water rights, senior water rights. So that was on the agenda. But I just don't know whether the legislature was able to reach agreement on it, because they had a huge surplus this year and they were talking about doing it. But I had an opportunity to talk to Senator McGuire, Majority Leader McGuire, and they, when I spoke to him, it was last week, and they just had not been able to come to agreement.
But it does raise a really interesting question about the ability of individual district like ours to invest in water rights, to be more secure. I'm not sure. Sure. I think the issue of whether the state should do that may be a little beyond what we need to be talking about, since I don't know how that would work for us. But I've certainly been approached by a number of people who are wondering why we're not exploring that as an option. It's certainly something I'd like to see be part of the water supply assessment. We have some pretty good opportunities to be doing just that, and to be creating some long-term redundancy and resilience for ourselves that we literally could turn on and off as needed. So I think that that option for Marin is looking more and more feasible and looking more and more financially viable.
Of course, we need a transport mechanism.
Yeah,
we do. And thank goodness we are involved in an environmental impact report that would give us exactly the path to that transport mechanism.
That's true.
There's one thing we have a lot of in this state, as you know better than most, Larry, it is infrastructure. There's just this one piece that is not quite done, but we are
missing.
In the middle of that assessment.
Yeah.
So we wouldn't need to be starting from, we aren't starting from scratch. So that's
the young man's
more
article.
viable. I have a couple of other quick questions, and I want to thank you all for a very clear presentation. I agree that consumers are doing well on conserving water. At the same time, of course, we know that Marin water is almost dead center in terms of the state's water utilities, in terms of communities, in terms of water use. And I think, Paul, the picture that you paint, I think is very accurate. It's very timely. So I really appreciate your laying that out. It does make a pretty strong case for, as some of us have been saying for a long time, a diverse portfolio, right? One that includes water augmentation as well as long-term demand reduction. So that's what makes some of these reports about this last meeting that the district is turning away from those investments somewhat concerning. We seem to be bucking the trend in the water industry, which is to position efficiency and on-site reuse as water supply. And I just want to share with everybody, I'm not sure how many people spend as much time with the American Water Works Association as I do, and I think Director Russell does, but they have a formal standard on water conservation and efficiency. It's a program standard, and it provides, in part, conserved water should be viewed as a source of water that provides multiple benefits. For example, growth, environmental flows, and expanded economic uses equal in importance to the utility's primary water source. In many cases, water conservation is the least cost option for new source of supply. And I'm concerned, so that's the end of their quote. It goes on, but that's the money quote. And I'm concerned that, it really doesn't get more mainstream than the American Water Works Association. So I think we really need to be examining that and examining our assumptions that there's nothing more we can do but hold steady. We really do seem to be out of step with the rest of California. Just a quick couple of examples. The Municipal Water District of Orange County, very much, very conservative, hardly a bastion of progressive thought, says an integral component of our overall water supply portfolio. Water use efficiency is our least expensive water source, providing multiple benefits to all water users. And the examples go on and on. So I think we need to be careful before we turn away from thinking about water reuse or on-site reuse and water efficiency as supply sources.
If I could just ask, I'm just surprised actually, because that's certainly not what I took from the last meeting.
Well, I wasn't there. I'm just saying I got about 7 or 8 emails from people very, very alarmed that the board had that the staff was pressing for, that the experts you hired basically said there's nowhere for us to go, that the investment in those programs is going to remain stable, and that we were not putting it on the list as a source of, that it was not going to be a source of supply the way that the augmentation options are. So if that's incorrect, this is a great time to set the record straight.
Yeah, I would encourage folks to go look at that recording. I think what we ended up with was laying out the program, the savings, and the cost per acre foot, and then concluding that this would be baked in to all of the scenarios, not that it was excluded from the scenarios at all. In fact, that there really isn't a scenario in which we would consider moving forward without conservation. So
no, but I think there's, I'm sorry, Paul, not to interrupt you,
right.
But there's conservation as the baseline, and then there is investing in it as a source of supply, as an additional, as an increment. We all know about passive conservation. We all know about the status quo. I haven't seen anything indicating that we're talking seriously about a water supply alternative that increases that investment, as your presentation today suggests we really should be considering.
So I think if you look at there's a chart, tables in the presentation that refer to savings of 4,000 acre feet per year in 2040. think is
right. Pretty far out there.
Well, I mean, our demand is still 29,000 acre feet or 30,000 acre feet without any savings at all. So you're still looking at, you know, somewhere in the region of 13, 14% savings. So I don't think that we're shying away. And when I discussed the program with Carrie, this is more than what we have done in the past. And we're
in a different situation than we were in the past, right?
We are, and we're doing more than we're proposing to do more than we've done in the past. And furthermore, I think that we laid out a pathway to do even more than that. It's just that we need to start thinking about policy-driven help for the incentive programs at a certain point, right? To really, you know, non-functional turf would be a perfect example, right? You could simply have a policy that said there shall be no non-functional turf in the district in 5 years. So those are things that we're certainly open to discussing and carrying forward. And that was sort of, I thought, more the tenor of the meeting that we had, not that we were not willing to move forward with it. So yeah,
that's helpful clarification. I mean, there was a sense that we were really, again, I wasn't there, and I apologize. Yeah. I had family commitments that didn't allow for me to be there. But like I say, it was a number of people that were concerned that there was a sense that we should no longer be considering this as its own option, that it's just being baked into the baseline. And I think that's
I would certainly
that needs to be brought forward.
Yeah, I would certainly offer my time, you know, if they wanted to come in as a group or talk to us as a group offline, you know, with or without members of the board, I would be happy to do that, to try to clarify anything. Yeah.
Great. We'll make that happen. Thanks, Paul.
Yeah. Yeah. I think this is one of these things where I wonder to some extent whether we've just haven't communicated it clearly, because I think I think as Director Kohler is trying to point out, and it's an important point, which is that conservation is a demand management strategy, and it has I think that there's different ways that one can look at it, but I think pointing out that the standard approach that is being used by American Water Works and other things helps us to have consistent language. I think the other part of it is showing, and I was at our last presentation. I think it's somewhat hidden to see that conservation, that not just the status quo, but there is an envisioned increase, I think, in our spending, our actual commitment of spending toward conservation. That is in effect, it is another, and there's a cost per acre foot for that yield. So I think it can be, I think it's set up, and it should be set up in a way that we can see it in comparison to the other alternatives. And I think that's been the intent, but maybe, again, we're showing it as baked in, which is great, because I think we all, at least I'll say that I would expect that it would be part of any path going forward, but it doesn't show itself separately as well. I don't know if Director Kohler, that's part of what you're wanting to be able to see it as in comparison to, and apples to apples comparison to other alternatives.
I think we do need to see it that way. And whenever we talk about something being baked in, it suggests that it is the status quo, right? We know the plumbing code is going to result in certain changes. We know that keeping our spending constant is going to result in certain long-term changes. I think what would really be helpful here, and I think Jacobs has done a great job on the supply augmentation strategies, and I have no doubt that we will be going forward with any number of them, because as we all know, well, we will, I think, certainly be going forward with any number of them, because again, as I've been saying for some time, as well as some of you, it really is going to take a portfolio of approach. But I think just baking in, I mean, supply is already baked in. We've got plenty of supply, that's baked in, but, generally that's the status quo. What we need is to really understand what we're doing on top of the status quo. And I think that is not clear. I mean, there's the one scenario. It's a separate conversation that's not agendized for tonight about those cost numbers. They seem very far, at least in my experience, out of whack with what we're seeing around California and the West, but that's, another conversation. But, I don't think we have seen an apples to apples comparison. And I have concerns about the process used. So, I mean, one thing I'd like to bring forward at some point is to bring in Madaus, that is, really the gold standard for exploring these things, for making it super clear. They did our last program with, tremendous success. So I think going back there and really having them do the kind of study that the board needs, that the public needs, to really understand these costs. I think, as you put it, Monty, on an apples to apples basis, because, we've been at this for a while and we seem to just not get there. So I think there's anxiety about that out there. And we can't really have that portfolio. We can't really have that balance if we're doing exclusively, if we've concluded, and, with all due respect to, the expert that you guys hired, if we've concluded that we're done, we are, notwithstanding that we're in the middle of the state in terms of our GPCD, there's nowhere else for us to go. And that just doesn't, I think that's not resonating with a lot of people. Maybe there's some brown lawns out there. There's, and I certainly think that we should be gardening. We just did a big, redo of our yard so we could have low water landscaping. I think some people are doing that, but we all know that that is not necessarily yet particularly common here, or that there's other opportunities, either using gray water or what it is. We've all talked about those options, but they're not particularly unreliable. In fact, it's the opposite, right? What we've seen is that relying on rain as a strategy is pretty uncertain. Most of these on-site reuse and water efficiency measures are, they're measurable, they're reliable, they give the same returns year after year, they're long-term investments. So to be treating them somehow differently from water augmentation strategies, I think really puts decision-making at a disadvantage.
For what it's worth, I did attend the meeting and I agree with Paul's assessment. So just FYI.
Okay, I have another question too.
Go ahead, Jack.
I'm changing gears here. I want to go back to the earlier part of your report, Paul, and the challenge of gambling on El Nino versus La Nina. Doesn't that call for more storage in either direction? Isn't the answer, at least in part, more storage?
I mean, it'll never hurt to have more storage, but you do want to, choose the best options for storage.
Well, across the board, we want to do that. Yeah.
Right. Yeah.
Okay. And of course, we need the water right to keep the water.
Right.
Right.
Right. And again, I'm second to none in my agreement about augmenting supply, but we have a lot of storage in this state. And if you look around, it has not protected us from this situation. So I just, as I said, rain is unreliable. That's probably our least reliable source of supply. So what about spending more time looking at sources of supply that we can access as needed? I don't want to lose track of this idea that was presented to me earlier this week by people suggesting that we buy some water rights, that the water district invest, some real money in, there's senior water rights for sale. And, with the right, with one sort of more piece in our infrastructure, that could present some very, very intriguing opportunities. I know that staff had concerns about buying water on the market, but if we simply owned the water rights and we were able to, sell that water or use that water during years we don't need it, it would actually be a source of income. And then during the years we needed it, we would simply have it. So it seems like a very intriguing opportunity that we should be examining.
Again, I strongly suggest you read that op-ed in the New York Times.
I did read it, Larry.
Oh, you did read it. Okay.
Yes.
Well, I don't know who did and who didn't. No one responded. So, but the point that he was making was he didn't think it was wise for individual water districts to get into that market. It should be done by a larger governmental group, just as a comment.
I understand. And I frankly disagree. I don't want to get too far down the road with that, but there's a lot to be said. We're in a somewhat unique situation, and there's really a lot to be said for having control over your own supply, for being able to generate income during years when you don't use it and have it available in the years that you do. There may be reasons for specific water districts not to do that, but I'll tell you, whatever that particular author had to say, it's happening, right? I mean, the big,
sure.
And I don't want to make too much out of one op-ed, but I mean, the big wealthy water districts in the South are buying up these rights. And I think it will behoove us to take note of that and to get ourselves into a position where we could have more reliability, where we'd have more resilience, where we'd have some more redundancy in our system and not be relying entirely on rain falling into reservoirs. You know, I mean, you only have to drive around Shasta and Lake Mead to see that all the storage in the world is not going to protect you from a drought.
So this is as an alternative is not something I think that's currently being looked at. This alternative of actually acquiring water rights, I would be open to hearing what, you know, how this would pencil out. You know, I mean, it's complicated, and I don't know what kind of comps or you know, there's a lot of assumptions. We'd have to have obviously the infrastructure to be able to move that water, but understanding, you know, how it pencils out, I think is just more information to help guide us toward making good decisions.
Yeah, I agree.
My hedge fund invested in Greeley, Colorado, and they paid $15,000 an acre foot for dependable supply. So just to put things in perspective, that's the kind of numbers that are being kicked around in the water business. And, you know, you kind of left out Stuart Resnick in your summary of water districts because he's a player too in this.
Of
whole.
Course, the biggest player.
Yeah.
The biggest player. You really want all of the water in the state to be owned by Stuart Resnick.
Sure, but MWD is the biggest player, but then Resnick comes
I'm
in
sorry,
there
the biggest private player.
Yeah, biggest private. Yes.
Yeah. Right.
Larry, any questions or comments?
You know, my comment about water rights and the state buying water rights was to return the water to the Delta, because we're in the process of killing the golden goose here in California. So even senior water rights get limited by the State Water Board. So, you know, it's just a question of where the rain falls. Does it fall in the Sierra or does it fall on Mount Tam? You know, both are still rain dependent. So, you know, I think it's worth looking into. There's, you know, I think we need to look into efficiency conservation in our own system, which we've been looking into, and tighten that up to the extent possible in the short term. So that's kind of what I'm looking at. But, you know, I'm intrigued by all the other options, you know.
Right. Well, and of course, the largest freshwater reservoir in the world is the Sierra Nevada snowpack. So
we have that.
Well, it is when you have the snow, but I mean, it's still the same reservoir, but it suffers the same issue as all of these. And that's always the tricky part.
Yeah.
Right. Monty, any more thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I want to echo what Larry Bragman was saying, which is, you know, we have to be mindful of the fact that, I mean, what's happening in the Colorado will affect California substantially and in ways that I don't think we really can predict. And so when we do look at options that are more of a statewide set of options, I think we have to recognize it's a very shifting landscape out there, and that any consideration of water from that sphere needs to really be looked at carefully to understand the risks and uncertainties. And we're trying to shore up and reduce risk and increase in certainty. So again, let's get the information together so we make good decisions that are informed, but also recognize the strengths and weaknesses of each alternative fairly and honestly.
I couldn't agree more. You know, what I would say is there's no way to eliminate risk, right? And one way to provide greater levels of certainty is to own your own water rights. Then you're not subject to the vagaries of the market. And, you know, it's also a way for us to be good environmental stewards, right? If we owned water rights in the Central Valley, for example, in the years that we're not using that water, we would have the capacity, and we could put whatever policies we wanted in place that, you know, that the board chose to put as much of that water back into the rivers as we wanted, or whatever. I'm just saying it would be a way of limiting what I think is going to be some very detrimental impacts in the Delta, a place that I spent a good 20 years of my career. I think I'm probably the only person on this call who has successfully prosecuted an endangered salmon case. And, you know, it is very intriguing to me. I'm not necessarily advocating it, but to your point, Monty, I'm concerned that we haven't even looked at it, because the possibilities in terms of providing greater certainty, providing greater resilience, while also providing some better environmental benefits, they are significant and they are worth exploring. And for whatever reason, we haven't yet.
Well, we actually did look at Yuba Water District. So, you know.
As a lease, not to buy.
Part of the assessment is also looking at sites reservoir, which, as you know, would be an offline reservoir, taking advantage of the sort of same winter water concept that we're looking at from the Russian. Yeah, interesting points, and I've taken a couple of notes. So thank you very much for the input. I would note that if you saw the governor's announcement earlier this month, right, take heart that at least we have the same list of supply topics and, you know, headings that they do. You know, looking at conservation, recycled water, desalination, stormwater, and storage, both surface and ground. And
minus the ag one, though. Minus the ag one.
Yeah, minus the ag doesn't apply so much for us. So I think we're on the right track, and there's a fair ways for us to go yet. I know everybody in the public wants to pick a horse and for it to be the winning horse, but we're just not there yet. And maybe there'll be many horses, you know, that win over a kind of long period of time as we look. We tend to get very focused on an individual point in time. And this is, you know, 20, 30, 40 year exercise that we'll be revisiting every 3 years.
Plus, Paul, it's statistical, as you talked about. I mean, you haven't really laid all that out.
Right.
But, you know, it's a pure statistical analysis. Remember, we have 100 years of data for a 4 billion year old planet. I mean, of course, you know, that's like 1 billionth of a second of Earth time. And, you know, that's the data we have. And then twisted on top of that is climate change, which perhaps eliminates the value of all of it.
Right.
Yeah. Backwards.
That's the key point. Looking backwards, you know, we've all been saying it, the past is no longer prologue. So you're right, we have all that data, but more and more water districts are becoming more and more skeptical. So I agree with you, Paul. I kind of like the silver buckshot approach as opposed to the horses. And, you know, as I've been saying for a long time, it's not just one. We cannot ever focus on one option. So that's part of why I think some of these other more out of the box things to think about, you know, they're not today solutions, maybe not even tomorrow, but they could be the 5 or 10 year solutions or the 20-year solutions. And hopefully the portfolio that's going to come out of this assessment will be capable of addressing those kinds of options.
Good point. So any other comments from the board? Okay, how about public comments? I'm sure we've stirred up some interest.
Yes, we have 4 public comments, or 4 speakers. The first 2, Clayton Smith and Ed Jameson. Go ahead, Mr. Smith.
My impression of the conversation last time was that with regard to the conservation issue, you're facing the law of diminishing returns. I think that there is a certain amount of limitation there, and it becomes much more expensive for each additional gain. And at a point, I think you reach a point where you kind of reach a sort of asymptotic situation where you could push it with all the money in the world and get nothing in addition, except a lot of public resentment. One of the things in demand management that I'm kind of surprised, having lived through the 1970s drought, one of the consequences of that was that there was a period where we had a general moratorium on new hookups. And of course, I know that right now, as a consequence of the ill-conceived housing legislation and the demand that we increase the housing in the county by about 8% to 12% over the next 8 years, stands in the way of this. But I think not having that as something on the table is something that the general public is going to be wondering about. I certainly wonder about that also. I would like, if possible, Paul to comment on the recent flooding, that record flooding that suddenly has occurred in Las Vegas and Death Valley. I also like to know whether or not anyone's looked at the Farmer's Almanac, which once upon a time was considered to be a fairly reliable source of future planning. That's why it's called farmers, because farmers who relied on essentially on rain were looking to it for guidance on planning. And also Lynn Ingram over at the University of Cal at Berkeley. What does she have to say about the climate cycle situation we're in? And I think it might be helpful also to talk to her a little bit about the what you were looking at, the temperature, the oceanic temperature anomalies that you're looking at, because she's done a great deal of study on the issue of El Nino, El Nina, and I would think it'd be very helpful to actually bring her over and have her ever give a talk on this and announce it to the public so we could all tune in. Thanks.
Thank you. Mr. Ed Jamison, please.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Paul Cellier is absolutely right. The Jacobs baseline forecast does bake in realistic conservation savings. Ms. Kohler, you continue to misrepresent the reality of the planning process, and you, more than any other board member, are responsible for our continuing to live on the edge of crisis. Ms. Kohler, pay attention to the presentations and quit wasting staff time chasing many immaterial so-called conservation opportunities. As Peter Mayer says, the conservation sponge has been wrung dry in Marin. And finally, a succinct presentation of reviews would be every bit as effective as your long-winded, repetitive arguing. It is a disservice both to the board and to 191,000 customers who continue to live in terror, largely because of your irresponsible, long-winded, repetitive hectoring. And Ms. Kohler, there is a way to reduce water risk. Invest in meaningful water resiliency here in Marin. And we don't have 20 years to deal with this problem. We could again be in crisis by next April, as President Russell has stated recently. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Phil Sauter, then Roger Roberts.
Thank you. I'd like to acknowledge that beginning with Paul's report and continuing through the director's conversations, I've never seen a better example of thinking globally and acting locally. And I thank you for that. I feel like we're in good hands with this staff and this board. I especially appreciated the conversation between Directors Kohler and Schmidt regarding how we keep conservation on a parallel level with the other water supply options. And for me, what that would look like is seeing a grid, just as we have for desal, for example, that talks about a capital investment, that talks about an annual budget, and that talks about a cost per acre foot. When I see those side by side and we look at them kind of interchangeably, and we say that 1,000 acre feet from this source is as good as 1,000 acre feet from that source, that to me is when conservation or demand management, I like the new term, will have really reached parity with the other options. So thank you very much for this discussion. It's been very helpful.
Thanks, Mr. Sauter. Mr. Roger Roberts.
Yes, good evening. I'm a little confused as usual. I understand how we would finance augmentation of supply by using long-term bonds. That's the normal process, which is backed by increased water rates to cover the cost of the bonding. I'm not quite sure how you can apply that to the purchase of water rights. Can somebody clarify that for me? Thank you.
Yes. It's a longer conversation, Roger, but I mean, basically, because water rights are an asset, they're a property right, they can be bond financed. But I'm happy to meet with you offline to discuss it. Water rights are not an annual expense.
Okay, thank you. Because conservation is considered an operating annual expense.
It doesn't have to be. GASB has a specific rule about water conservation that's long-term because it's also not an annual expense. People don't change out their toilets every year. They don't change out their lawns every year. They don't buy new tech every year. So GASB has a specific rule that offers an alternative, as we've discussed before. And again, you and I can meet offline and I can go over that with you.
Yeah, well, that latter point has never been clarified to me.
I'm happy to have that. I just don't want to take up too much time here with that, but why don't we connect offline and I'm happy to discuss it with you. Okay. Because there's now specific GASB technical guidance on water conservation and consumer rebates and direct installations, with GASB recognizing that they are not annual expenses. And so they have another accounting mechanism that allows those to be capitalized.
Ah, well, that's interesting. That's news for me. Thank you.
Sure.
The next three speakers, James Krajewski, Valerie Erickson, then Larry Minikes. Go ahead, Mr. Krajewski.
Hi, thank you. I just want to comment on the issue of conservation again. I'm all in favor of conservation, but the problem with the discussions of it is that nobody has an endpoint for conservation. Nobody has a vision of what is the endpoint. It's like saying everybody needs to go on a diet without saying, well, this is what the goal of a diet is. This is how many calories you ought to consume. Or everybody needs to be on a budget. And then saying, but this is the bottom line, how you can spend this much money, and above that, you shouldn't spend it. So the goal of conservation, I think, is a good one. But I was a little bit surprised when Director Kohler said something, there may be some brown yards out there. Apparently, she hasn't been in Corte Madera lately because there are occasionally, rarely, a green lawn out there. And there's artificial grass that's green. So what I'd like to see in these discussions about conservation, what's the end point? Because it's meaningless without having some kind of endpoint. And it's costly to have conservation. All of these options ought to be on the table, and they all ought to be considered, and they are being considered. I very much appreciate the presentation and the discussion by Paul. I think that's been very helpful, and it's been very enlightening. Thank you.
Thank you. Next speaker is Ms. Valerie Erickson.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, good. Okay, I was very excited to read in the Marin IJ that you all were looking into desalinization. I know it's controversial. I understand that. But is the location the same place that was on the ballot, I don't know how many years ago? What was the location and what do they say the cost is and the time? I know in Contra Costa they're doing it now, and even Governor Newsom came out in favor of that. But I was just wondering the cost and the time and the location. And in the meantime, all we can do is at least have no new hookups, because I think we're talking about civilization here. And the place in Petaluma that is cheaper and doesn't use osmosis and diffusion is called KATADYN group. And I don't know much about this stuff, but it sounds like it's worthy of looking into.
Is that it, Ms. Erickson? I apologize.
I think so. Don't apologize, Terry. That's great.
Okay. All right. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay. And next, Mr. Larry Minikes.
Good evening.
Mr. Minikes.
Good evening. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, wonderful. We're leaving our strongest tool for conservation on the table, and we're not discussing it. You know, what we're looking at from the presentation on conservation is a 0.5% decrease between now and 2045 per capita per year. It seems rather doable. However, the way it was presented only gave one option. What we really need to look at is we need to find out the costs of Director Kohler's suggestion to buy senior water rights certainly needs to be the idea of then we need to install the intertie. And what this is going to do to our water rates. Plus, we have to look at our infrastructure needs and we have to look at our wildland fire needs and upgrade all of these. So what we're talking about are quite serious increases like we've not seen before in the cost of water to where water really needs to be, so that we're paying for the true cost of what it requires to run a water district, if I can say it that way. And when we do this and we measure how this affects the consumer, we're going to see a drop in use as you raise rates, as we're seeing with gasoline. As you raise rates, unless it's absolutely necessary for businesses and such, we will see drops in use. And I think we need to bring that on the table, do a study and see what happens when we raise by this percent, and by that percent, and understand what is really one of our best conservation tools of all. Thank you.
Thank you. There are no further public comments. Oh, yes, there is none.
Thank you. You know, just a comment. I had to be in LA. I'm in LA right now. The last several times, at least once a week in August, and it's something I've never seen before that I can remember. I grew up in LA. You can see the mountains now. And in the summer in August, that's just something you don't see. And the mountains are clear. Now, it could be some offshore wind or something, but I don't think so. I think it's improvements in control in the auto business. And it gives me real hope from a technology standpoint that there are technological solutions to man-made pollution and man-made difficulties. So it just a comment of hope. Okay, with that, how about item 8?
Good evening. So, okay,
Future meetings.
August 17th, tomorrow is our Communications and Water Efficiency Committee meeting at 9:30. So I expect to see you, no pajamas.
Yeah.
August 19th, Operations Committee. Then Thursday, August 25th is the Finance and Administration Committee meeting. Then Tuesday, September 6th, we have our regular Board of Directors meetings, but I'm not too sure of the time start. I have it at 6 o'clock tentative because there are a few closed session items that needs to go to the board, but I will work with you offline on that. And external meetings, Friday, September 2nd, the North Bay Watershed Association board meeting is at 9:30. And I think they're still looking for a location. And that's it.
And keep in mind, the September 2nd meeting is particularly important of the MBWA because they're bringing in an expert to talk about the fiscal impacts on water and the image of water districts and how they're viewed by the public. It's a guy from UCLA, a professor, and he's quite effective in his conversation and his viewpoint. So I strongly suggest that those who can attend it. I think you'll find it very interesting.
And that's the North Bay Watershed Association board meeting if the public is interested.
September 2nd, yes. And the board. I really was talking more to the board.
Yeah.
But
9:30.
Yeah. Okay, cool. Well, thank you all. Very interesting meeting. And with that, we'll adjourn.
All right.
Thank you all.
Thanks all.
Night, folks.
Bye-bye.
See you tomorrow morning.